She was 9, freezing, and being forced to sweep the sidewalk by her abusive director. A giant tattooed biker pulled over, angry at his motorcycle. She was terrified of him, but more terrified of the man in the window. Her tiny frozen fingers tucked her thumb in and closed, a hidden signal. The biker's eyes snapped to hers. He went rigid. He gave one sharp nod and rode away. The director laughed, not knowing that nod had just activated an army. If you're new to the channel, don't forget to subscribe to help us reach our goal of 1,000 subscribers. Lily was 9 years old, and she had already mastered the art of being invisible. She was a ghost in second-hand shoes, navigating the cold hallways of the Brightwood Children's Home. In the 2 years since the state of Ohio had placed her here, she learned that survival was not about being strong, it was about being silent. She was a creature of pure observation, a tiny, resilient spirit with pale blue eyes that had seen far too much darkness, and absolutely zero justice. The other children were loud, broken by their pasts. Lily was quiet, defined only by the hope she refused to let go of, even as the gray November dampness of Ashtabula seemed determined to extinguish it. Her suffering was a constant, quiet hum beneath the floorboards of her life. She carried the immediate grief of being an orphan, a sharp pain that loneliness never dulled, but this was compounded by the daily oppression of a system that saw her only as a case number. Before we dive deeper into Lily's story, I want to know, where are you watching this from? Drop your city and country in the comments right now. Lily was small for her age, a fact Hendricks, the director, often used against her. Yet her spirit, though battered, remained stubbornly unbroken, focused only on the next day. This purity manifested in small, secret acts of rebellion. These acts were not vandalism or defiance. They were acts of profound kindness. When the kitchen served stale bread, which was often, Lily would hide half of her portion under her thin mattress. She would wait until the lights were out and the sounds of crying had subsided, then pass the bread to the 6-year-old boy in the bunk below her, the one who always seemed to be hungry. She had found a single piece of blue chalk in the gravel yard, and she used it to draw small birds on the concrete behind the dumpsters, a hidden gallery of hope for the younger children. Lily was not a fighter. She was a survivor. Her entire world was contained within the chain-link fence of Brightwood. She dreamed not of rescue, but of a sign, a signal. Years ago, during a mandatory clinic visit, she had seen a laminated poster tacked to the wall. It was about domestic violence. It showed a hand signal, the thumb tucked inside, the 4 fingers closing over it, a silent cry for help. She practiced it in secret, under her blanket at night, in the back of the line for dinner. It was not a plan. It was a prayer, whispered from her fingers to a God she was not sure was listening. The setting for this quiet desperation was Ashtabula, Ohio. It was a small, exhausted port city on the shore of Lake Erie, deep in the American Rust Belt. November had arrived like a sentence, bringing a biting, damp wind that smelled of cold steel and dying industry. The main street was a testament to better days, with boarded-up storefronts and fading murals. A profound sense of hopelessness had settled over the town, a communal sigh of resignation. The town was too busy with its own slow decay to worry about what happened behind the walls of the state-run orphanage. On the edge of its borders, the Brightwood Children's Home was the epicenter of this specialized despair. It was an ugly, foreboding building of dark red brick, surrounded by a high fence topped with wire. The sign out front claimed it was for the protection of the children. The peeling paint on the window frames and the rusted metal swings in the yard told a different story. The atmosphere inside was cold. This was not just from the inadequate heating that Hendricks refused to fix. It was a coldness of the soul, a complete absence of human warmth or compassion. The children here were warehoused, not nurtured. The antagonist of this story, the source of the cold, was Mr. Arthur Hendricks. He was the director of Brightwood. To the outside world, to the occasional state inspectors, he was a tired, overworked bureaucrat, doing his best with limited resources. In private, behind the locked door of his office, he was a petty and corrupt tyrant. He was not a man of overt violence. He was far more dangerous. He was a master of psychological oppression, systematic neglect, and the weaponization of bureaucratic rules. He knew, with absolute certainty, that no one was watching and no one cared. The incident began, as it so often did, with an act of Lily's kindness being twisted into a crime. Hendricks accused her of stealing an apple from the cafeteria. In reality, she had saved it from her own lunch tray and given it to a younger boy who was crying from hunger. Hendricks did not care about the distinction. He saw only defiance, a break in the perfect, silent obedience he demanded. He decided a public lesson was required, one that would serve as a warning to the other children who might be observing her resilience and getting ideas of their own. His punishment was specific and cruel, designed for maximum humiliation and discomfort. Lily was ordered to sweep the wet, rotting leaves from the long public sidewalk in front of the orphanage. It was 38 degrees outside, the wind coming off Lake Erie cutting through the air like glass. Hendricks forced her to do it wearing only her standard-issue paper-thin t-shirt and worn jeans. He stood in the window of his warm office, watching her, a small smirk on his face. He wanted her to be seen. He wanted her to feel small, cold, and utterly powerless. A sudden sound tore through the oppressive gray quiet of the afternoon. It was not thunder. It was a deep guttural roar that seemed to rise from the pavement itself. It grew louder, a percussive, angry noise that rattled the windows of the passing cars. A motorcycle, heavy and black with blinding chrome accents, pulled over abruptly, stopping directly in front of the Brightwood gate. The engine idled with a sound like a contained explosion. It was a Harley-Davidson, customized and clearly powerful, and it seemed to radiate menace even while standing still. The rider was a giant. He dismounted in one fluid motion, planting heavy boots on the asphalt. His name was Hammer, though Lily would not know this. He was the sergeant-at-arms for a notorious multi-state motorcycle club. He was everything the town of Ashtabula crossed the street to avoid. He was huge, well over 6 feet, with a chest and shoulders that stretched the leather of his club vest, known as a cut. His presence alone seemed to lower the temperature of the air around him, a focal point of raw power. His appearance was a checklist of societal fears. A wild, unkempt beard fell to his chest. His arms, thick as utility poles, were covered in intricate, colorful tattoos that disappeared beneath his sleeves. His cut was adorned with patches. A large, menacing skull dominated the back, with rockers claiming his territory. More patches covered the front, an American flag, a POW-MIA emblem, and a citation from the Marine Corps. He looked like the physical embodiment of a bad decision, a man who had seen the worst of the world and decided to become worse. Hammer was angry. He let out a string of curses aimed at his motorcycle. It appeared the machine had sputtered, a mechanical issue that had forced him to stop. He kicked the front tire in frustration. He was a man on a mission, already late, and this delay was infuriating. He was not looking for trouble. He was not looking for anything but the solution to his engine problem. He paced for a moment, pulling a phone from his pocket, clearly annoyed, and then he looked up, his gaze sweeping the area. His eyes, dark and intense, moved past the fence and locked onto the small figure on the sidewalk. He saw her, Lily. She was shaking violently, her lips blue, her hands raw and red as she tried to grip the oversized broom. She was so small she looked like a mistake, a forgotten doll left out in the rain. She was terrified, not just of the cold, but of this new, frightening development, this giant man staring at her. She froze, the broom slipping from her numb fingers and clattering onto the concrete. Hammer's eyes narrowed. He was a man who understood power dynamics. He registered the girl's thin clothing, the freezing weather, the inappropriate task. Then his gaze flicked up, past her to the orphanage window. He saw him, Arthur Hendricks, standing there watching. Hendricks was not concerned. He was amused. He even raised his coffee mug in a mock toast to the biker, a smirk of absolute control on his face. He was the king of the small, miserable castle, and he feared nothing. Lily, trapped between these two forces, made a choice. She saw the cruel amusement on Hendricks' face, the face of her daily tormentor. Then she looked back at the giant on the sidewalk. He was terrifying. He looked like a monster from a storybook, but he was not Hendricks. He was an outsider. He was someone who did not belong to the system that was slowly crushing her. In that fraction of a second, she decided to use her prayer. She decided to send her signal, her one and only hope. Her tiny, frozen fingers, barely able to move, came together in front of her. She looked directly at Hammer, her eyes pleading. She tucked her thumb tightly against her palm. Then slowly, deliberately, she closed her 4 fingers over it. She held the signal for 1 second, 2 seconds. A silent scream for help fired across the 10 feet of pavement that separated them. She was not just asking for help from him. She was asking if help, anywhere in the world, still existed. Hammer's entire body went rigid. The annoyance on his face vanished, replaced by a cold, sharp focus. He was a combat veteran. He had done 2 tours in Fallujah. He knew that signal. He had been trained to look for it. It was the sign of a hostage. It was the sign of a prisoner. It was the sign of someone in desperate, immediate danger who could not speak. It was a sign that demanded a response. He looked from her tiny, clenched fist to her terrified eyes. His gaze snapped back to the window. Hendricks was still there, smiling, oblivious to the meaning of the gesture. He just saw a child interacting with a dangerous man. Hammer looked back at Lily. He understood. He understood the entire dynamic. The man in the window was the jailer. The girl was the prisoner. He, Hammer, was the only one who had just received the message. He did not smile. He did not speak. He simply gave one short, sharp, definitive nod. It was a promise. It was an acknowledgement. It was a contract. Lily's eyes widened, a tiny spark of something, maybe hope, lighting within them. Hammer turned his back to her, swung his leg over the bike, and kicked the starter. The engine exploded to life, a roar of defiance that rattled the windows of the orphanage. It was louder this time, an intentional show of force. Hendricks instinctively stepped back from the window. Hammer revved the engine twice, then pulled into traffic, disappearing down the gray Ohio road. Hendricks had seen the entire exchange. He had seen the child make a gesture. He had seen the biker nod. He did not understand the signal, but he understood the intent. It was defiance. It was an appeal to an outside authority. It was a violation of his absolute rule. His face, moments before amused, turned purple with a silent, cold rage. The humiliation of a child was one thing. The defiance of that child was something else entirely. It was a challenge to his power, and it would not go unpunished. He stormed out of his office and down the main hall, his hard-soled shoes echoing like gunshots on the linoleum. He grabbed Lily from the sidewalk, his fingers digging into the thin flesh of her upper arm, bruising her instantly. He dragged her inside, ignoring the stares of the other children. He did not yell. He hissed. "What did you say to him? Who do you think you are talking to criminal trash like that? Trying to make me look bad?" She was silent, shaking, her hope already turning to ash. He pulled her down the hallway to the utility closet at the far end of the building. This was his preferred tool of punishment. It was dark, windowless, and smelled strongly of industrial bleach and damp plaster. It was the place the children feared most. He shoved her inside and she stumbled, falling onto the hard concrete floor. The space was barely big enough for her to sit down. It was cold, and the darkness was absolute. She was completely, terrifyingly alone. "You want to ask for help from your tough guy friends?" Hendricks mocked from the other side of the door. "Let's see if your biker friend can hear you crying from in here." He laughed, a dry, joyless sound. The heavy lock clicked, plunging Lily into a darkness so profound it felt solid. This was her lowest point. The signal had failed. She had not found a savior. She had only angered her jailer. She curled into a small ball on the floor and believed, for the first time, that she would never get out. The system was designed to protect Hendricks, not Lily. This despair was built on experience. She had tried to get help before. 6 months ago, she had told a guidance counselor from the local middle school who was visiting Brightwood. She had spoken softly about the cold, the lack of food, and the quiet room. The counselor, following protocol, immediately filed a report. That report went directly to Director Hendricks, who was praised for facilitating open communication with the children under his care. Hendricks had waited a week, then calmly called the counselor back. He explained that Lily, tragically, was fantasy-prone due to her background trauma. He showed the counselor the official file he had fabricated, filled with notes about Lily's trouble with the truth. The counselor, satisfied and overworked, closed the case. The school system, the first line of defense, had failed her. It had taken her plea for help and handed it directly to her abuser as a weapon. The police were no better. The local Ashtabula patrol cars viewed Brightwood as the state's problem. They only came if there was a runaway, which they treated as an annoyance. An officer had come once on an unrelated matter, and Lily, desperate, had tried to tell him that Hendricks was stealing the food. The officer, annoyed by the interruption, had laughed. "Tough life, kid," he'd said, patting her on the head. "Mr. Hendricks runs a tight ship here. You should be grateful." The police system had failed her. The state's child protective services were the final firewall, and the most useless. The caseworkers were buried under mountains of paperwork, responsible for hundreds of children across 3 counties. Their visits were always announced weeks in advance. Hendricks would use the time to scrub the building, order a truckload of fresh food, and turn the heat up. He would present his immaculate files, his balanced budgets, and his fabricated psychological reports on problem children like Lily. The caseworkers, checking boxes on a form, saw a compliant facility. They saw Director Hendricks as a partner in the thankless job of child welfare. They saw Lily's file, which officially branded her as an unreliable narrator, a source of problematic fantasies. The system that was funded to protect her had instead provided the very paperwork that made Hendricks untouchable. She was officially, legally, a liar. Her voice had been stripped from her by the same people who were supposed to amplify it. This was the moral vacuum. The school, the police, and the state had all failed. They had looked at the situation and, through incompetence, apathy, or bureaucracy, had sided with the oppressor. Hendricks knew he was safe. He knew no one would ever believe a 9-year-old liar over his perfect file. files. He had created a fortress of neglect. He returned to his office, poured another cup of coffee, and sat down to review the orphanage's finances, deciding which funds to divert to his personal account next. But Hammer was not part of that system. He had not gone home. He had not gone to a bar. He rode his Harley hard, the engine screaming, bypassing the town and heading for an old, unassuming building on the outskirts. A simple sign read, VFW Hall. This was the unofficial headquarters for the local chapter of his motorcycle club. He parked his bike and stormed inside, the door slamming open. The laughter and conversation in the room immediately ceased. He walked past the bar, past the pool tables, directly to a man sitting in the back. This was Prez, the club president. He was an older man, quieter than Hammer, with an air of absolute authority. Hammer leaned down, speaking low and urgent, but every man in the room heard the words. I was on the north side, by the state home. I saw a kid, a little girl. She gave the signal. The silence in the room changed. It became heavy, focused. The word kid shifted the atmosphere from a hangout to a war room. The signal confirmed it. These men, veterans mostly, lived by a code that society had forgotten, but they held as sacred. The code was simple. You do not, under any circumstance, touch a child. It was the one law that had no exceptions. It was the one sin that demanded immediate, overwhelming retribution. Prez looked at Hammer and saw the truth in his eyes. He pulled out his phone. He did not call the police. He did not call child services. He called the president of the Cleveland chapter. Then he called the president of the Pittsburgh chapter. Then the president of the Detroit chapter. The message was the same. We have a situation. A child. An orphan. She's confirmed prisoner status. He listened, then finished the call. I need you. I need everyone. And bring everything. The network, a silent web of leather and steel, had been activated. The next morning dawned cold and gray. No different from the last. Arthur Hendricks was in his office by 7, as always. He was meticulously transferring some from the orphanage's heating oil budget into his private retirement account. He felt secure, untouchable. He heard a low, distant murmur. He ignored it, assuming it was a maintenance truck on the highway, or perhaps the first rumblings of a snowstorm rolling in from Lake Erie. He had forgotten all about the biker and the girl. The murmur did not fade. It grew. It became a low, guttural rumble that seemed to be coming from the ground itself. The pencils on Hendricks's desk began to vibrate. The glass of his window shivered, rattling in its frame. This was not thunder. It was something else. It was mechanical. It was angry. He stood up, annoyed by the distraction, and walked to the window, pulling back the blinds to see what road construction was causing the disturbance. The children saw it first, faces pressed against the cold glass of the cafeteria. They pointed, their breakfast forgotten. The sound was deafening now, a wall of noise that drowned out all other thought. Hendricks looked out his window and his blood turned to ice. The street was gone. It was no longer visible. The entire block in both directions was filled with motorcycles. It was not 20 bikes. It was 500. It was 1,000. It was an ocean of black leather and polished chrome, a river of steel that had flooded the entire neighborhood. They were parked in perfect, orderly ranks, surrounding the Brightwood Children's Home, blocking every entrance, every exit. An army of silent giants sat on their machines, engines idling in a unified, terrifying roar that shook the very foundations of the building. The message was clear. The building was now under siege. No one was coming in, and no one was getting out. Hendricks fumbled for his phone, his hands shaking so violently he could barely dial. He got through to the Ashtabula police dispatcher, his voice a high-pitched scream. Send everyone. It's a gang attack. Hell's Angels. They're surrounding the orphanage. Hundreds of them. They have weapons! Hurry! He was yelling, convinced his life was over, that they were here to burn the building to the ground for his perceived insult to their member the day before. Within 3 minutes, 2 local police cruisers arrived. They turned the corner, sirens blaring, and skidded to a halt a full block away. The 2 officers stared, paralyzed by the sheer scale of what they were seeing. This was not a local disturbance. This was an occupation. They were hopelessly, laughably outgunned. The bikers did not even turn to look at them. They just sat, motors rumbling, 1,000 eyes fixed on the front door of Brightwood. The police cut their sirens. Then, the twist, the thing that no one, especially Hendricks, could have predicted. The bikers began to dismount. They were not pulling weapons. They were not carrying torches. Instead, the doors of large panel vans and pickup trucks that had arrived with the convoy began to open. Men started unloading boxes, pallets of goods. They were organized, moving with a quiet, disciplined efficiency efficiency that spoke of military training. They did not bring guns. They brought receipts. They did not bring chains. They brought lawyers in sharp suits who stepped out of a black sedan that had pulled up right behind the lead bikes. They brought forensic accountants, men in club cuts carrying briefcases. They brought independent journalists, bloggers with cameras who began filming everything, live streaming the event to a global audience. They brought pallet after pallet of new blankets, boxes of fresh food, diapers, clothing, and toys. Hammer and Prez, the president, swung off their bikes. They walked calmly up the sidewalk, their boots heavy on the concrete Lily had been forced to sweep. They did not try to break down the door. They did not shout threats. They stood on the front step and knocked politely, their gloved fists rapping sharply on the wood. The sound was almost comical amidst the thunder of the idling engines. They waited patiently. Inside, Hendricks was hiding under his desk, still on the line with the dispatcher, babbling incoherently. He refused to answer. He was terrified. After 30 seconds, one of the lawyers stepped forward. He taped a document to the door. It was a legally filed writ for an emergency citizens audit, citing publicly available state charters regarding the welfare of minors and suspected misuse of public funds. They were not here to break the law. They were here to enforce it. If you believe that power should not be used to protect predators, smash that like button. Your engagement proves that people care more about real justice than bureaucratic politics. The bikers were not attacking the system. They were exposing it, using a floodlight so bright it would scorch the cockroaches from their hiding places. The sound of the engines was not a threat of violence. It was the sound of accountability. It was the sound of 1,000 witnesses arriving at once. The unimaginable thing was not the violence. It was the brutal, terrifying efficiency of their bureaucracy. While the lawyers held the legal line, one team of bikers, identifying themselves as licensed contractors, electricians, and plumbers, began a walk-around inspection of the building's exterior. They noted the broken heating units, the dangerously frayed wiring near the junction box, the drafty, rotting window frames. They documented every single code violation Hendricks had ignored. Simultaneously, another group began setting up a full-field kitchen on the lawn. Portable griddles were fired up, and the smell of sizzling bacon and pancakes began to mix with the smell of exhaust. They were preparing to feed every child a hot, nutritious breakfast, the kind of meal they had not seen in years. They were not just here to punish the guilty, they were here to care for the innocent. A third team, the accountants, accompanied the lawyers. When Hendricks still refused to open the door, the lawyers informed the police, who were still watching, that they would be filing obstruction charges. The police, trapped between a corrupt administrator and 1,000 angry bikers, finally found their courage. They unlocked the front door and escorted the lawyers and accountants inside. The siege had become an audit. Hammer and Prez entered the building. They did not go to the office. They walked the hallways. They saw the peeling paint, the thin blankets on the metal cots, the emptiness of the pantry. They moved with a purpose. Hammer knew exactly where he was going. He was looking for the dark place. He was looking for the closet Hendricks had taunted him with. He found it at the end of the hall. It was locked from the outside. He did not bother with a key. He raised his heavy boot and kicked the door once. The wood frame splintered and the door flew open, crashing against the wall. The sound echoed through the entire building. A final definitive act of liberation. The team of forensic accountants, meanwhile, had entered Hendricks' office. He was sitting in his chair, pale and sweating. They did not speak to him. They simply began their work. They opened his ledgers. They booted his computer. They found the double-entry bookkeeping almost immediately. They found the offshore accounts. They found the records of the funds diverted from the children's food and medical budgets. The entire corrupt scheme was laid bare in less than 30 minutes. When the state authorities finally arrived, summoned not by Hendricks' panicked call but by the club's lawyers, they found an undeniable scene. They found Arthur Hendricks being legally detained by the club's attorneys, who were calmly presenting irrefutable documented proof of felony embezzlement and systemic child abuse. The state agents who had ignored Lily's pleas for years were now confronted with a mountain of evidence they could not bury. The system, forced into a corner, had no choice but to finally act. The state agents also found a sight that would be seared into their memories. The entire front lawn of Brightwood was filled with children. They were wrapped in new warm blankets, eating plates piled high with pancakes and bacon, served to them by the largest, most tattooed men they had ever seen. The sound was no longer the intimidating roar of engines. It was the sound of children laughing, a sound that had not been heard in these walls for a very long time. Hammer walked past the chaos of the audit. He walked to the end of the hall, to the splintered door of the isolation closet. He looked inside. Lily was huddled in the far corner, her hands over her ears, her eyes shut tight, convinced the world was ending. She had heard the crash, the yelling, and now the silence. silence. She flinched as Hammer's massive frame blocked the light from the hallway, casting her back into shadow. She was terrified he was another version of Hendrix. The giant of a man knelt. It was an awkward, difficult motion for his large frame, but he got down on one knee, bringing himself level with her. He did not reach for her. He did not speak loudly. He simply stayed there for a moment, letting her see him. Then, he reached into the pocket of his leather cut and pulled something out. It was a small, brand-new teddy bear. Soft and brown. He held it out to her in his huge, tattooed hand. Lily stared at the bear, then at his eyes. She saw no anger there, only a deep, quiet sadness. She slowly, hesitantly, reached out and took the bear. She pulled it to her chest, her fingers gripping the soft fur. Hammer's rough voice was gentle. "We heard you," he said. "You did good. You are safe now." He stood up, waited for her to follow him out of the darkness, and walked her into the hallway, where the smell of pancakes was thick in the air. The resolution was total. Hendrix was arrested on the spot. The state, facing a massive lawsuit and a public relations nightmare streamed live by the independent journalists, immediately dissolved the Brightwood board. The children were placed in emergency foster care, with several of the club members who were already certified as foster parents stepping up to take them in immediately. The bikers did not just expose the problem, they provided the solution. They did not leave. For the next 2 weeks, the bikers, led by their contractor members, stayed. They gutted the corrupt, cold building down to the studs. They rewired the electricity. They installed a new industrial furnace. They replaced the roof. They rebuilt the kitchen. They painted the walls in bright, warm colors. They built a brand new playground. They rebuilt the house from a place of fear into a home of safety, funded entirely by the club's national organization. Lily was adopted by a family chosen by the club, a quiet couple who lived on a farm 2 counties over. Hammer was the first visitor she was allowed. He gave her one last gift, a tiny, child-sized leather vest, identical to his, with a single patch on the back. It did not have a skull. It had a teddy bear. It said property of the club and family. She was no longer an orphan. She was one of them. The town and the system would never look at a leather cut the same way again. The moral is simple. Courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is being 9 years old, cold and alone, and making a signal in the dark, believing that someone, somewhere, might answer. And true family is not always the blood you are born with. It is the people who show up when the entire world has abandoned you. They are the ones who ride through the storm to stand between you and the darkness. Share this video with someone who needs to remember that heroes still exist. They do not always wear capes. Sometimes they wear leather.